All right, well, thanks everybody for coming. Even though it's kind of dreary all weekend, so at least you get to sit inside the schoolhouse a little bit. I've been talking to some of you, so hopefully some of you have been here before. If not, I am Dustin Dubuque. I am the museum manager here today. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that I recently released. This presentation, I usually don't try to talk too long because I understand sitting in these desks is a lot less comfortable today than it was, back when you were a kid. So we'll go a little quick and I'll talk about my book. And I'm assuming since a lot of you are here, you guys know enough about Andersonville prison. That's what made it interesting to come hear me speak. So a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Wisconsin. I actually still live there. I'm from Boyceville, Wisconsin, small town, that doesn't matter. But I do have a bachelor's degree from UW River Falls, and I have a master's degree from UW Eau Claire. And what you're going to hear today is my master's thesis turned into a book. But I am the education and programming coordinator at the Dunn County Historical Society, which is based out of Menominee, Wisconsin. And I'm the museum manager here, which is for the Washington County Historical Society. So I keep myself pretty busy. And now with the book, it's even more busy. So how did this all come about? I think the journey for me to write my book is pretty interesting as well. It's not just pick a topic kind of. So what I had to do is, I got my master's and came part to do my thesis, and I had no idea what to do. Menominee, Wisconsin, much like Stillwater, is a big logging town and a city. So I was like, I'll just do logging, I'll do something with that. That's pretty easy. But some of my staff members there, our former curator, he actually told me about this diary that we had. We had this digital form of this diary from a man who was from Menominee, Wisconsin. And he's like, you should give it a read. It's pretty interesting. Then maybe this could be a really interesting topic for you. So I got a thesis advisor based on the Civil War. And he read the diary a little bit, and he heard my synopsis of it, and he goes, yeah, you're not going to be able to write on this. He's like, there's absolutely no way that anybody has not written on this diary yet. So he's like, I'll get back to you in a week. So he calls me back into his office about a week later, and he tells me, well, guess what? You lucked out. Nobody has written about this diary yet. He said he's found it used a couple times in footnotes, but he's never seen it actually fully written on. So we had a digital diary at the Dunn County Historical Society. The physical copy of this diary by Newell Burch is at the Minnesota Historical Society. So we had to figure out a different one. If you write a thesis, you realize that there has to be a spin on your thesis. There has to be a reason why you're writing it. I can't just write a paper based on a diary. That's just not a master's thesis in history. You have to have a spin on it. What makes it important? What makes it worth writing and spending all this time on? And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is what makes Newell Burch so special and why is his diary different from many Civil War diaries that you find. So a couple things about the diary first. So he had a diary and a memoir. The original diary, which he had physically with him in the Civil War, was from 1862 to 1863. It was actually in two different little memoranda books that he wrote in. He wrote day-to-day accounts of what he was going through while he was in the Civil War, while he was marching with the Union Army, and different things. In December of 1863, he ran out of paper. And at that point, he was also a prisoner in Belle Isle prison, so he had no way of getting any more paper. So from 1863 to April 21st, 1865, it's a memoir, which is his third book, which he wrote about a year after he got released from prison in the Civil War. So that's kind of the little general gist of it. But a little bit about Newell. So he was born in January 1842. He's from Chautauqua County, New York City, just New York. He was a farm boy, but one thing about him being a farm boy, and one of the first things that really make him an interesting person, is the fact that he kept a diary at all because he knew how to write. That was one of the big upsides he had while he was in the Civil War, and we'll get a little bit farther into it. But he was a part of the 154th New York Volunteer. He took $5 with him. He got up on his horse and he rode to the nearest station to enlist. He went up to his mom and said, I'm going, and that's it. So he's 20 years old, didn't want to farm anymore, and he'd rather become a Union soldier. So he was part of the Army of the Potomac. There you go. So August 1862, he officially enlisted. This is actually housed at the Minnesota Historical Society. It is a hand-done badge. Their infantry, 154th, actually didn't have their own badges, so they created their own, and he donated it to the his family donated to the Minnesota Historical Society. So he eventually started in September 2nd of 1862. He was furloughed into the Civil War, and pretty much this is where his diary starts on his day-to-day accounts of what he's going through. It's pretty quick that we find out that Newell's pretty well liked in his group. He's pretty smart. He knows how to write. He knows how to read. He gets placed as corporal of the guard, which is taking night shifts and stuff. And it pretty much is a respected thing that you do to watch over your men. And then so he begins marching. So he's marching down south, and it's pretty quick in his diary that this is becoming very monotonous. He had the idea of when you start marching in the Union, or for the Union, that you were fighting and you were going at it and you were fighting Confederate soldiers. But for about the first 3 months he was in the Civil War, he was not doing any of that. He was staying in camp, he was drilling, he was marching 18 to 20 miles every single day down south, and he was not that interested. And he was starting to become a little depressed. So we're going into about the early 1863. He starts marching down to Fredericksburg. And again, most people probably know enough about the Civil War. I'm not going to go really heavily into the battles and such because it's been written about hundreds of millions of times. So he is also one of the people on the Rappahannock River, which became a very big basin of infighting between the Confederates and the Union. He was one of the people that was building bridges between the North and the South to cross the Rappahannock River to keep going south to fight the Confederates. So this was during the Battle of Bull Run 1 and 2. He was not near any of these battles, but he started to hear going through the grapevine of all these great battles that everybody was getting into. He's writing in his diary how depressed he was, that he wasn't in any of these battles. Newell Burch slowly became sick, and this is kind of the beginning of what makes Newell really interesting, is he became really sick, and he started writing about his diary. He had a really bad case of lung fever, and he started putting some mustard poultice on his chest to help relieve the tension. And it was just a kind of an idea he came up with. He wasn't big into the medics that were in his regiment, so he would always find different ways of curing his sickness, which was pretty common in the Civil War. So they just marched through Fredericksburg. This was a big Union campaign. If you read anything about it, the Union lost and they lost quite a few men, and Burch spoke of some of the men he knew from other brigades that were there. So and I don't have my pointer with me, but I am a teacher, so he came down. This is Gettysburg right up here. And right now he's about Fredericksburg right here, but they know that they have to get up to Gettysburg. So they actually marched south for a while, and they realized that they had to remarch north because they knew, Gettysburg was going to happen. So onward to Gettysburg, they marched north to Centerville, past Bull Run, and all these different places that I'm sure you've heard of if you watched any or read any Civil War stuff. So they get to Gettysburg. Again, I don't probably have to tell you what happened at Gettysburg, but July 1st to 3rd, roughly 50,000 men on both sides were killed. Big Union victory, but the first night was not. The first night of Gettysburg was a large Confederate victory before the Union started pushing up the hill, which really helped them win this little 3-day battle. But the very first night at Gettysburg, Newell Burch was taken prisoner by the Confederates. Literally before he got to the fighting, he immediately was taken captive. His entire brigade, he had about 67 people in his brigade, but it was down to about 35. Some people had died in some battles, sickness, and all these things. They were all taken prisoner by the Confederates. So now they had to march south to Richmond, Virginia. So they marched for about 10 to 12 days to get down to Richmond, Virginia, which is 20, 25 miles at a time, maybe hop on a train here and there. And now he is officially a prisoner of war. So when he's writing in his diary, he's letting everybody know that there he is. Now he is a prisoner of war. There's nothing he can do about it. So he first got to Belle Isle Prison, which is again Richmond, Virginia, at the end of July of 1863. The one thing he noted in his diary is that it was extremely hot there. He didn't know how they were going to survive the heat. So right next to Belle Isle was this large metal building, which used to be a warehouse. That was a big center point for the Confederates. So Richmond, I'm sure probably some of you know, but Richmond, Virginia was a big booming town at the time and big into like helping create weapons and manufacture weapons, move trains throughout, bring in prisoners into for the Confederates. So it was a pretty booming place. He remembers arriving off the train and getting off the train, and he and his brigade and a bunch of other men that were captured at Gettysburg had to walk this really narrow bridge to get to Belle Isle. He remembers people in Richmond throwing stuff at him, throwing food at him, throwing rocks at him, yelling profanity at him because they were Union in the South. So Belle Isle Prison was about a mile to a length of patch of land, and it was about 1/4 a mile wide. So it was a pretty small area. And they only denoted 4 acres of land for the prison, so very small area. And that became quickly overcrowded, which, again, you guys know Andersonville is known for being overcrowded. Pretty much every prisoner of war camp was overcrowded at the time. So he's stuck here on this 4 acres of land, but one thing that they realized, the Confederate soldiers, is because usually at most of these prisoner of war camps, the Confederate soldiers, they were usually lacking in people to work at them. As I was telling these fine people before they got here, or before the presentation started, that the Confederate soldiers who were running the Civil War prisons were pretty much not very well educated. They were usually the worst of the worst soldiers. So there was not enough of them to run, 3,000-4,000 people. So they ended up realizing that Newell Burch was taking notes in his diary. They thought, oh, he can write. Maybe we should give him a job. So he ended up getting a job where he stood at the gates at Belle Isle every single day and took the names of the people that were entering and exiting the prison. Another thing about prisoner of war camps, if you guys don't know, is they were not set up to hurt and kill people. They were actually set up just to house people. That was really it. So if I took a Confederate soldier and brought him up to Elmira, New York, at their prisoner of war camp, the point wasn't to starve them or have them die. The point was just for them to survive so they weren't fighting against me. It was pretty much a location so they weren't no longer shooting guns at me anymore. But we realized pretty quick that that's just not how they were. He was taking names of people going in and out because they even traded prisoners. If you had 100 people and you wanted 100 people of yours back, they would actually trade people too. It was a really odd system that was going to work for about the first couple months, but slowly, as the Civil War went on, it was pretty well deteriorating. So here's Belle Isle now. So the 4 acres that the people were on was way up here. The reason why we know that is because it's all swampland. And that's the reason why they built the prison there, is because what else are we doing with this land besides right up there? So again, 4 acres of that land, it was a swampy, mucky area, and it was down into a little ravine, which is hard to see under the trees. So 3,000 to 4,000 people at one time were housed in this 4 acre area, 5,000 at the most. So again, it's wet and it's hot and there's no shelter because none of them trees were there. So here's a picture of if you were standing on the land in Richmond and you were going, the bridge is actually tucked behind this house right here, or this building. So here's the island you could see, and up over the ravine to the backside is where the prison was located. Here's another good picture of Belle Isle. You can see the Confederate guards right here, and you can see the dip, and you can see all these tents. That's what it all is. It's shanties, tents, and people. And again, on this little pact of land, which you can see the back of the island there, where the water starts, there was 3,000 to 5,000 people at one time. So at this point, Burch had to realize that he needed to survive this somehow. Again, it's hot. There's very little food. What are we going to do to survive such an ordeal? Because he knew very early on that this was not good. So he began trading with the guards. One thing is again, because prisoner of war camps weren't like what we think of a prison is usually if you came in with a canteen and a hot plate, you could keep your canteen and hot plate. That was just something you could have. If you came in with money or greenbacks, you could literally keep that stuff because that wasn't the point of the prison. But if you had that stuff, you could trade it with the guards to get more food. So even though the guards' food wasn't that great, but they got bigger rations and more things, so he began trading with the guards. He had a lot of greenbacks at the time, so they were prized possessions for the Confederates, Confederate money. So that's what he began to do. And he realized that this was just something that had to happen for him to survive. The other cool thing is him and his friend, which in my book, there's a really great little write-up on Eben S. Eli, who was a friend of Burch's that stays with Burch the entire time, and I believe there's a book written on him as well. And they ended up getting a job running a boat. So what they do is, again, because they're on an island, they get a job running supplies back and forth from Richmond to the island. Instead of carrying them across the bridge, they actually get a job for the Confederates, running the boat and getting supplies. Again, Newell Burch takes notes of every single thing that he's doing, gives them to the Confederates and such. So that's, again, another good thing that he was doing. that I think helped keep him alive during this situation. I already talked about the prisoner exchange. This is where Burch was writing in his diary that they were exchanging prisoners between the north and the southern prisons. The only thing about it is usually they were exchanging the healthiest of the healthy because they wanted their healthy prisoners back. So that's kind of what was happening. So if you were sick in any way, if you were African American or Latino, you weren't getting traded with. Newell Burch was sick quite often, and he was kind of useful for the Confederates, so they never traded him. So he was never traded outside of the prison. So he has another round of sickness. At this point in the diary, I think this is later in about September of 1863, he notes that 1,000 men came into the prison in about a week. So there was 4,000 people in the prison, and in 1 week, there was another 1,000 there. He realizes that now there's the sickness, scurvy, dysentery, gangrene is running rampant. Smallpox is all over the prison. This is because the germ theory hasn't been figured out yet. This U.S. Sanitary Commission is literally just getting started. So because of prisoner of war camps and the Civil War is the reason why the U.S. started the Sanitary Commission. So this is the first time where the Sanitary Commission is actually sending people from the U.S. government to look at these prisons to figure out how do we make these not as nasty and gross as they really are. But we didn't have that. Like they would even bring in supplies. They'd bring in boxes of coats, boxes of pants, but they would bring not enough to even do anything. They'd maybe like clothe 75 men of 5,000 at a time. So what could you do? So in December 1863, this is where Burch runs out of paper. So from now on, it's all about the after, what he wrote about after. And this is also notable too, because this is where he gets the smallpox vaccine. So he got actually smallpox vaccine 3 different times in the hospital at Belle Isle. And a big thing about it is he gets a huge infection in his smallpox vaccination, which was pretty common. Usually gangrene came out of obviously cuts and anything like that, but vaccinations were done very poorly at the time. So people were getting gangrene in their arms regularly, and he believed that he had gangrene buildup in one of his arms. So, and at this point he was getting sicker and sicker. He had one arm in a sling. He also had a crutch for one of his legs. So he has scurvy, he has diarrhea, he has dysentery, he has a fever, one of his arms is in a sling, and he has one of his legs up on a crutch. Not the greatest life he's living right now. And he's malnourished, he doesn't have any food. But his good thing is his friend Ibn S. Eli is quite healthy and is actually helping him move around the prison. But on February 24th, he is moved from the Belle Isle prison after being in there for 8 months to Andersonville, Georgia, in the Andersonville prison. Here's a picture here's a Union soldier from Belle Isle prison. You can see it's pretty horrible how sick he is after not having any food. So he enters Andersonville in February in 1864, a couple days after he's released from Belle Isle. And one of the kind of interesting things is he notes in his diary when he arrives, he arrives in the first 2 weeks it was open. And he writes how gorgeous it is. He thinks about how amazing this place is, how it's going to be so easy to survive here. He sees trees, he sees a river, he sees all these things and goes, I can live here. This is much better than Belle Isle. And I'm assuming that all of you know a little bit about Andersonville Prison while I'm here. That's not how it actually goes. So Andersonville is about 16.5 acres at this point. It's only supposed to house about 10,000 people max. Eventually it ends up housing about 35,000 at the max, which isn't good. It eventually expands in 10 acres. That's where they actually cut down all the trees and all the shade to fit more people. And so this was people from Richmond, Virginia, Belle Isle, and Danville. They were eager to trade. Again, the first month he was excited. He really was. He saw new faces. Not everybody was as sick. He literally could pick his spot where he wanted to sleep. He brought his tarp, and him and his buddy Ibn S. Eli, they set up their camp. They had a tree. They had brush, and it was seeming pretty good at the time. So here's a picture. This is probably the most famous drawing of Andersonville out there. You can see it all the time. So this is after, but the big thing about Andersonville, and the reason why it was built here was the river. That's what they wanted. That was the prime thing of Andersonville Prison. There was running, flowing water. And we'll get into it a little bit of why that quickly became maybe the worst thing that happened. You can see up here, this is actually the Confederate housing unit. So that's where they lived. Over here and on this side were a couple different hospitals, which come into play later. But again, it's supposed to house 10,000 people, and it houses about 30-something thousand. And this gentleman has a good story about somebody he knows that was there. So we'll talk about that after. So here's another great picture of it, overshot. But yeah, again, you can see this, and you can see all the men, Confederate soldiers, living outside the prison walls. So the condition, he set up camp right next to the creek because he, again, wanting water, food, all them great things. Originally, it was supposed to be for drinking water, but quickly, a couple things happened. The Confederate soldiers, like I said, at the top of the river, that was their housing units. Let's just say when they had to empty out any grease from their food, they just dumped it in the river and it flowed into the prison and flowed out. If they had to clean the outhouse or any horse stables, they would dump it in the river and it would flow down the river through the prison. And the men that were in prison in Andersonville would take baths in it, would shower in it, and go to the bathroom in the river. So quickly, the infestation was just covering this river. He writes in his diary about how he could see all the flies, he could see the slime on the top of the river, you could see the animal, like just the insects floating over it. He said the smell was so bad, and there is other people's Civil War diaries where Confederate soldiers actually moved their camps away from the prison because you could be 2 miles away from the prison and smell the stench of the river. So that, of course, is now getting a lot of people sick. He writes also about how people were digging holes with shovels in their hands to catch rainwater, so hopefully they had a little bit of clean water. So again, at this time, Burch is in really poor health. This is the only time in his diary where he writes about actually feeling he's going to die. He writes that it's coming, the end is near, and he has no escape out of this, and he's done. He's going to die. But he gets a little bit of happiness in his way. Burnside's army, which again, General Burnside gets captured, there are about 5,000 people show up in Andersonville in about a day. They get excited, all the prisoners there do, because of the fact that these people have money and a lot of stuff to trade. So that kind of lifts Burch's spirits a little bit, even though he's been there for a handful of months now. So, like I said, water grew worse and worse. Disease is getting spread all throughout. Again, dysentery, diarrhea, scurvy. I mean, anything that you want to assume that you had in the Civil War, these people did. This is when the prison extension and the crowding. So this is about mid 1864 in the summer. Again, it's hot. Yeah, so it's bad stuff. I don't know if I've gotten that point across yet, how bad it was. Has that worked yet, that it's not a very good place to live? So now these 30,000 men are in Andersonville prison. They extend it 10 acres. But where are these men going to live? They literally knock all these trees down that were growing in a swamp. So now these men have to cross over and live in the swampy area. These men were given no blankets. These men were given no tents. So all the people that were coming in had nothing. So they were just sleeping. And most of these people had no clothes on. Burch at one point was naked for about a month or two during his stay. So he talks about the sun in the summer just hurting him immensely. And this is also about the time where Andersonville starts training dead people out. Every couple days, 100, 200 people would be trained out of Andersonville or on a wagon or on a food truck trying to get rid of all the dead. He also learned that his diet was really poor. Pretty much all you were eating was beans, maybe a piece of pork, maybe once a week, and cornmeal, which was pretty much corn husks jammed into a paste. And that was it. They were lucky to have a skillet, so they actually could cook some of their food. So he realized that he needed to start eating better and actually using the skillet, even though he was really sick. So here's a couple photos. This photo is pretty famous Andersonville prisoner photo. But as you can see, that these are both prisoners from Andersonville that were taken once the prison closed. And you can see what happens when you don't get any food or water for days on end. So here's another good picture. So here's the swamp. Here's the dredging system to keep the swamp going. And you can see, I just think it's a good picture, but you can see all the people. And again, at this time, the water is completely infested with mosquitoes and everything. You don't even want to be in it or drink it, but yet there's nowhere else to live. So you're forced to live next to it anyway. So this is kind of an interesting story. So this is where my master's thesis kind of really started to take shape of why I would write about Newell Burch. So he writes in his diary that there's a man from the 100th New York Volunteer. He had gangrene really, really bad in one of his arms. He was really sick. They brought him into his camp, and a couple men were like, all right, what can we do? So Newell Burch, what he did is he took Castile soap, he took some flaxseed and some coal, and he scrubbed the guy's arm and fixed it up, and he's like, I'm gonna cure this guy's gangrene. You guys all know today that we still, in 2017, you can't cure gangrene once it's officially been done. It's the killing of your nerves, and granted in 2017, we also don't let gangrene get that bad. It just, most people don't. But in, again, 1864, they had no idea of this. So Newell Burch did all these things, and the guy was feeling pretty good, and one morning they woke up and he was dead in their camp. And Newell writes in his diary, I have no idea why he didn't survive. I did exactly what I should have done. I cleaned his wound out, I did what I did to myself, and he died, and I don't understand. But the cool thing about this is Newell Burch had the thought process to help cure somebody in a way that he didn't need to. If I was a prisoner in Andersonville, Georgia, I would help no one and try to keep myself alive, but that's just me. The fact that he's going out of his way to try to come up with a home remedy is pretty amazing. At this point, the hospitals in Andersonville were overflowing with people. You almost couldn't even get to the hospital because you can't walk. You're probably too weak to walk 16 acres to get to the hospital, or 8 acres, however far away you live. And they're already full. So you kind of had to do your own thing. So that's what Burch started to do. So Burch started to realize that, okay, that didn't work, but I'm really sick. He again had no clothes. He ended up finding a bag that was used for corn, this flaxseed bag, and he ended up fashioning a pair of pants out of it. He writes that he wore those pants for 9 months, he said. So he realized that because he was so sick that he needed to move closer to the hospital. He left everybody he knew and walked by himself. Again, walked or crawled, whatever he did. He did say he crawled for a while. His one arm was in a sling. He had a crutch. Again, scurvy, dysentery, and he had a really bad infection from the smallpox vaccination still. So this is where he became a little resourceful. And I guess I throw this in here. This is an actual plate that he had with him the entire time, from the day he was in the Civil War to the last day he was there. This is on display at the museum in Menominee. But it pretty much writes about how this was the one thing. He had two things with him the entire time. He had his plate and his Bible that he carried with him the entire time he was there. They never got lost. And they're both housed on display at the Dunn County Historical Society in Menominee. And this piece of food, ration, cracker, we do believe it's Newell Burch's because we do believe it came with his collection, so he saved that too, which is pretty amazing. Granted, he could have got it after the fact. So he's got to realize that he's got to get in the hospital. There's just no way about it. So he actually arrives at the hospital in September of 1864. He needs to fix his knees and arm problems, so what he does is he actually gets some turpentine, which isn't very good, and he rubs it on his knees and his joints, which does actually work, but it's 2017 and we know just not to do that. But he ends up realizing that he needs to fix himself because he can't get in this hospital. So what he decided to do is his arm was super infected and he swore he had gangrene. So what he did is he put nitric oxide on it, had Castile soap, and burnt his infection 3 weeks in a row and kept burning it and burning it. And finally he realized, oh my gosh, it's kind of getting better. He also used new bandages every single time. The fact that he somehow, in 1864, there was no reason to use a new bandage. But he did, because he even writes in his diary that he felt the need to use a new bandage every time. Usually in this prison, there's a good chance you took a bandage off, you washed it quick, and you used it on somebody else. So he did that, and he's like, oh my gosh, my arm's not infected anymore. I cured gangrene. Again, you can't do that. But he firmly believed he did. And the other thing about it is, so he gets into the hospital. So this is what gangrene can look like. It's pretty much the killing reasons why, Civil War, the biggest thing that surgical practice in the Civil War was amputations. When you had gangrene, cut your arm, cut your toes, cut your legs off. Nothing you could do about it. So eventually Newell Burch gets into the hospital. He meets Dr. Bates, who runs a couple of the wards at the hospital. And he literally walks up to him and goes, look what I did. And he showed him. And he showed him the process, the Castile soap, the bandages, the burning. proof, or a little proof of what doctors' philosophies were at the time, he believed him. Dr. Bates believed that Newell Burch could cure gangrene. He was surprised, he was shocked, he couldn't believe it. So he actually put Newell Burch in charge of an entire ward of the hospital. So that's the lack of knowledge that they knew at the time. So he became a hospital steward, Newell Burch did. And then he actually became a ward master where he ran an entire tent of people only with gangrene cases. So Newell Burch got new Band-Aids, Castile soap, nitric acid, flaxseed, and that's what he did. He cured gangrene. He got extra large rations for his time, so he got fed better. He got a little more, he was able just to stay at the hospital and sleep. And there was not enough nurses and doctors to go around. So anybody with a little bit of hope that he could give helped it out. He even became so good at what he was doing that he was helped curing scurvy as well. He started rubbing people with paste, and he started giving them some booze. He found some booze, and he said that the booze helped a little. I'm sure it did. And but no, that's like one thing that this is the part of my thesis where Newell Burch becomes somebody different. The fact that he not only helped other people, and the fact that he was able to come up with these ideas to help people that were sick. There's no reason he needed to do this, and he did, and it's pretty amazing. So this is what a ward hospital looked like. So this was what. So this is a ward, which is what one of those are, but this is about the breakdown of the Andersonville prison. You would go down to the hospital, and here would be all these. You'd have scurvy here, dysentery people here, gangrene people up there, all the different things. And so he ran one of these wards, which was usually about 12 bunks, and there was usually 3 people in each bunk because there was too many people. You had to double, triple up. And here's a rendering of the hospital, so you can see all these men just laying across each other because there's no room. And if I didn't say, so of the 33 to 35,000 people that were housed at Andersonville, 13,000 died. So you had a 1 in 3 chance of dying in Andersonville. And he was there for quite a long time. So he gained the trust of this doctor so much that by the end of the war, which is early 1865, he actually got to go and stay at the doctor's house outside the walls. The doctor actually got called away for 2 weeks. He put Newell Burch in charge of his house and his farm. That's how resourceful Newell Burch was, that he was able to do this. He got fed. He wasn't in prison for 2 weeks. He would sneak some of the food back to his friends in Andersonville. He said not to tell anybody in his diary that he would sneak it through the gates. But in April 21st, 1865, the Civil War was over. Newell Burch spent 21 months as a prisoner of war. He was in Andersonville for 13 months. I'm now doing as much research as physically possible to figure out if anybody was in there any longer than he was, because he was there in the first 2 weeks. It's pretty hard to imagine how many other people were there for 13 months and survived the whole ordeal. It's pretty crazy. So he ends up getting discharged. And the funniest and worst thing about it is the second the Civil War was over, they were free to go. But where do you go when you're in Andersonville, Georgia? You're sick. You literally just in prison for 13 months, so guess what? You have to walk 50 miles to the nearest train station. So that's what they did. And he walked north. He writes in the diary that he got to Vicksburg, Tennessee. That was where he finally got on a train. And he carved his name into a tree up there. He got to see Old Glory flag fly. And he started crying. He said it was the only time in the Civil War he cried. He just felt so impassionate that he survived and that the Union won. So here's his discharge paper. It's at the Minnesota Historical Society. This is kind of a cool little piece. This is at the Dunn County Historical Society in Menominee. This is actually a tiny little piece of wood that is from when they tore down the Andersonville prison stockade in 1885. He went to the coronation and he got this little plug, and that's his signature across the back of it. So he got to have a little piece of the prison that he was stationed in for so long when they finally tore it down. We also have another piece of wood that he just stole off the ground. So his life after the war, and this is where my little my locale comes in again from Menominee, Wisconsin. He married his wife in 1869, and then they moved up to Menominee, Wisconsin randomly. He became a prominent figure in Menominee at the time. The Menominee had one of the largest lumber companies in the United States called the Knapp Stout Lumber Company. He worked for them. He was their bookkeeper. What a shock. And he also owned a mercantile store on Main Street. And he lived there until 1908 when he finally passed away. He had 6 children, and he is buried at the Historic Evergreen Cemetery in Menominee. So this is his headstone right here, him and his wife Susan, which is very nice, and it's a gorgeous cemetery. And this is a great picture as well, because at the beginning of the presentation, that's the one picture we thought anybody had of Newell Burch. He actually has a relative and a descendant that I grew to know, and she gave me a picture of a bunch of guys standing she gave me a whole bunch of pictures. She's like, maybe one of these is Newell, and boom, one of them was. So there's Evergreen Cemetery in Menominee, Wisconsin. It's a gorgeous cemetery. If you're ever in Menominee, I know it sounds morbid to go to a cemetery, but man, it's a gorgeous cemetery to go to. It's on a little island in the middle of the lake. So she's actually, her descendant lives down south. He has a lot of relatives in Puerto Rico now. But yeah, no, it's a pretty cool story. I think that's about the end of my presentation. But you know, that's where it came from, and hopefully that was pretty interesting, I think. And this is where people usually tell me a cool story about Andersonville that they know.